Well, good morning, everyone. Great to see you all. Open up your Bible to Hebrews chapter 11. No doubt one of your favorite chapters is mine as well. And Hebrews chapter 11, we're going to be talking about faith this morning. And speaking of faith, some of you have been involved in teaching your teenagers how to drive, which requires a lot of faith on your part. You find yourself in many risky situations. And if you've ever been teaching your teenager to drive, once you kind of pass the book test, the book knowledge, you get out there on the road and, you're trying to help them, like when to brake and accelerate. No, don't use your left foot, use your right foot. You're giving them down the road and you start teaching them this principle that you've got to focus on where you're going. You've got to focus out there beyond you. You can't just be caught up with where you are. Okay, so in other words, you can't be like waving to the pretty girls or, hairy-legged guys, and you can't be flirting, you can't be texting, you can't be focused on the present, you can't just kind of be, all into the music and you're kind of dancing around. Like, you've got to be looking out ahead. In fact, especially at night, when, you kind of go through the driver's dark night of the soul and you've got things coming at you. And it's really important that you know where to focus on the road. And so instead of staring at the oncoming lights, which will actually cause you to steer into their direction, you look, you find kind of out there, the little guardrail or something on the right side of the road, and you're kind of, measuring against that because and what you want your teenager to know is that where you look really determines how you live. If you're not looking in the right place, you don't live long. And it's an important principle. And when we come to the chapter this morning, it's the same principle. If you really want to live, then be careful of where you look. And it's this idea of looking to the future. So if you're in chapter 11, we're going to take a look at what God says about faith as it relates to our future. Let me just remind you that in the book of Hebrews, you're talking about a group of people. They were Jewish believers. They were being tempted to kind of back away from their following Christ and even drift back into Judaism. He says, don't you do it. Don't go back. And for our purposes this morning, it's always the same idea for us. Maybe not going back into Judaism, but just kind of backing off. Just kind of letting up on the accelerator a little bit, possibly some flirting with going back into the old life, the old value system, old priorities, old lifestyle. And whatever it is, the writer of Hebrews says, hey, look, don't do it. It's not worth it. Jesus is better. That's what he's arguing over and over and over again. This relates directly to where we're going this morning. But remember, he says, here's a couple of reasons why you want to keep following faithfully with Christ. Number one is Jesus is far superior. He's better than anything that you could go back into. And so remember, I've said that the writer is wooing us, reminding us how great, how superior is Jesus. Anything in Judaism, certainly anything back compared to our old life. But the second thing is he says, hey, there's some warning too. In fact, last week we looked at a very strong warning passage where we learned that as believers that God will do what he can to kind of redirect us. Like if you're tempted to kind of bail, if you're tempted to kind of like give up on your faith and go back, like the Lord's going to like try to get you and steer you back in there, and that he'll discipline you. In fact, discipline can, we learn, be pretty severe at times. But then this morning, we're going to pick up on a sub-theme that's also been present through the whole book. And that is that there is something to be gained. There is something to be gained. Listen, do you know this? Do you believe this? There is something to be gained other than entrance into heaven, as great as that is. There's something to be gained other than that if you understand, could so capture your imagination that when you think, I can only imagine, like you're thinking like, man, this is going to be so great. And let me tell you, friends, like you can either forfeit that or you can live in a way of radical commitment to Jesus because of how great he is and because of anticipating this future that he promises to us who really sell out. And let me tell you, this is the chapter, I think, it's really this book, but this chapter in particular, I think that really answers the question, why would you, if you understand that Jesus promises you forgiveness of your sins and assures you of a home in heaven, and he promises that to you up front, for everyone who places their faith alone in Christ alone for their salvation. By that I mean, like, they're not trusting in themselves, they're not believing in Jesus plus believing in their good works, or they're trusting in the work that Jesus did. And they admit, like, I'm not savable apart from what Jesus did. Like, he died, he gave his life for me, and I believe that. Jesus, I want you to be my Savior. Like, everyone who does that, why would those people then choose to live a really radical Christian life? In other words, it may not be our experience, but some who just kind of look at this doctrine of eternal security and assurance of salvation, we go, oh man, it seems like people would kind of, trust Jesus, believe in Jesus, kind of get that world, that next world, and then kind of, get the best of this world. Why not just try to live the best of both worlds? Why in the world would a believer say, you know what, I'm going to start giving time to helping children come to faith, or I'm going to give time to teaching children or discipling teenagers or working to disciple adults? Why would I spend time in ministry? I mean, man, I work really hard all week. And now I can afford that boat, and I just want to be out on the lake early Sunday, all day Sunday. I just want to I want to enjoy the fruits of my labor right now. Why would they give up on that and go serve people? Why would someone choose, amidst all of their own problems and demands of life, choose to be involved in the problems emotionally, spiritually, morally of other people? Like, why would I invest in that? Why would I give my money? Are you kidding me? Why would I give my money? Your financial advisor says, what are you doing giving this much money away? Why would you do that? Why would someone take the last half of their life and go overseas? Why would someone give their entire adult life? Why would people in the last third of their life go and only see their grandkids during, a furlough every 5 years or so, or maybe over the Skype? What moves people to live at such a radical commitment for Jesus? I think the answer is found in this chapter. And what we want to do is just kind of move through this, a long chapter. We're going to read through it. I'm going to comment. I'm just going to be able to highlight some things that basically say, what difference should eternal perspective really make on your life? Because this chapter is all about eternal perspective. And he's going to take case study after case study after case study after case study, and he's going to argue from the saints of the Old Testament that what kept them faithful through the years was their future look, their gaze into the future, this eternal city which is to come, which, by the way, is still future to us. That they were fixated on it, and because of that, they lived faithfully. And it's such a challenge to the readers, because here they are, they're thinking about backing away from Jesus and kind of going back into Judaism. And the writer of Hebrews says, look at the studs, look at the stars in Judaism. Look at the people that you admire. They were looking forward to Jesus. In fact, they were waiting for promises that weren't going to come until Jesus comes. But they didn't get their promises, but they were fixated on the future. Like, can't you take a lesson from them? Don't go backwards, move forward. Gaze forward, because where you look impacts how you live. So in first three points, we need to get going in here or we'll never get through it. Okay, number one, faith looks beyond this material world. Faith looks beyond what is visible. Faith looks beyond kind of what you can see and hear and taste and touch and feel. Faith looks beyond this material world. And this kind of jumps at us several times in these first 7 verses. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for. It's the conviction of things not seen. For by it, the people of old received their commendation. By faith, we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. You see what he's saying here. Faith sees like the invisible realities. It sees like things that are now material that came out of an immaterial, things that are visible that came from invisible. Okay, faith sees invisible realities. He continues, by faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous. Now, that's the second time you've seen the word commended. You'll see it 3 more times before the end of the chapter. This idea that, that like faith not only sees the invisible, it sees beyond visible realities, but faith also sees visible reward. There is this commendation from God to those who live by faith. God, again, commending him by accepting his gifts, and through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. By faith, Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death, and he was not found because God had taken him. Now, before he was taken, he was, again, commended as having pleased God. And without faith, it's impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must, 1, believe that he exists, though you cannot see him. You believe that he exists, and 2, that he rewards those who seek him. Okay? So this idea of seeing beyond the material is that faith sees invisible realities. Faith receives visible reward. In fact, to live the kind of life that we're looking here, like if you were ever to get your name in this chapter one day, it's that you live this kind of way where you believe that God exists and that he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. That's what you believe. And that orients your life. He gives us another example. By faith, Noah, being warned by God concerning events as what? Yet unseen. In reverent fear, constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this, he condemned the world and became an heir of the righteousness that comes by faith. So that's the first idea to get in your head. Okay, that faith, the kind of faith we're talking about, sees beyond the material world. That your life consists of a spiritual reality that if you fail to recognize, if you don't assimilate into your think system, if you don't let it impact your lifestyle, then you won't live by faith. You won't live this way. For example, someone who really is thinking about the spiritual realities of the day, they go to work each day thinking, you know what? My real identity is that I'm a saved daughter or son of the King. And I'm an ambassador of Jesus Christ, representing him to the world. And I live undercover, disguised as an engineer, a plumber, a teacher, a whatever. That's kind of the way that I kind of make a living for my family and I fund the kingdom. But I exist to try to represent Jesus to a lost world and to try to share Christ. It's the spiritual, unseen realities that really dominate my whole approach to life. That's this idea. That's what faith looks like. Okay, but as we go forward, he now is going to develop a point where he's going to take a lot more time to develop. And it's this, is that faith looks forward to the eternal world. Okay, it looks beyond the material world, but it looks forward to the eternal world. There's something out there in the future. It was future for them, but it remains future for us as well. And faith is fixated on that. Now, he's going to give us several examples. He'll spend some time on the patriarchs, Abraham and his wife Sarah and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph. He'll talk about the patriarchs. Now remember, if you're new to the Bible, that's a long time ago. That's way before Jesus. That's way before King David. Okay, that's before Moses. This is the book of Genesis, the patriarchs. But then he'll also spend some time about Moses, following the patriarchs, and talk about how they looked forward. I want you to see that. In fact, let me read this, starting with verse 8 to 28. Watch this. He says, now, by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was, now watch this, just circle this, underline this, where he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants, as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. Now, these all died by faith. All died in faith, not having received the things promised. Now, you've got to try to get your heart and mind around that. There were part of the promises they received. They did receive the land. There were descendants. But the bigger part of the promises were still yet to be realized when they died. Now, I'll come back to that. We'll come back to this. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having what? Seen them from afar. They're forward looking. But having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. Is that the way you think of yourself? As a pilgrim, a stranger, a Bedouin? Saying that they were exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus, make it clear that they, what? Are seeking a homeland. And if they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, in other words, where they originated, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country. That is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And he considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. By faith, Isaac invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. He's talking about how the patriarchs passed down the blessing, the promised blessing of how God was going to use them. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. There he dies in Egypt. He knows that God's promise for his descendants is in the promised land, what would become Israel. And he says, hey, whenever you go, which was going to be about 400 years later, this is when you go, take my bones with you. Faith, looking forward. A little bit more. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months. Well, let me stop there. I'm going to talk about Moses in a minute. Okay. All right. Now, there's so much to be said here, but from the patriarchs and about faith looking forward, this looking forward to an eternal world, I want to call your attention 3 things. First of all, they speak of a permanent city. A permanent city. So in verse 10, we read, therefore, Abraham was looking forward to the city that has foundations. Now, what is he trying to say there? Okay, now these folks were Bedouins. Okay, so they made their way out in the desert. They lived in the desert. They lived in tents, and they would kind of hang out for a while in certain areas, and then they moved to a different area. And if you read Genesis, you can trace Abraham's movement. From and the patriarchs from Bethel to Beersheba. All different places. Their existence was anything but permanent. But he says there's a city coming with foundations. Now, when you start living on a structure with foundations, that's a permanent city. And let me tell you, it's interesting, but when we fast forward to Revelation, and where Jesus starts talking, giving us more detail about this future city. Look at what he says. Let me show you Revelation 21. It says there that John is called up, and to see the heavenly vision of what's to come. And he says, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more, neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. Later in that same chapter, he will actually give the measurements of the dimensions of this new city that comes down. He says there will be 12 gates. And then he says there'll be 12 foundations. In that, believe it or not, somehow in God's revelation to Abraham, that Abraham could see beyond a day when his descendants would populate Israel to a day when the very city of God would make its way to planet Earth. Now, I know this may be new to you, but when you start thinking about the events of the end days, that there is this period when Jesus comes down and defeats his enemies and sets up his kingdom, which Revelation 19 repeats over and over and over again. It's going to be 1,000 years long. And then there's kind of a new heaven and new earth, which will be the place where we live out the rest of our days in eternity. And so Abraham, looking forward beyond this material world to this eternal world, sees, first of all, a permanent city. But the second thing I want you to pay attention to in Hebrews is that he sees a prepared city. A prepared city. So looking at verse 16, he's talking that, let me pick up with verse 15. He says, if they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country. Remember how significant that word is in the book of Hebrews. You know, Jesus is better, a better high priest, better than the angels, better than Moses, a better country. That is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their city because why? Here's the evidence. I'm not ashamed because I have prepared for you a city. There we see the repetition of the word city. Many of you in attending funerals have heard the speaker talk from John 14. Remember what Jesus says there? Let me show it to you. Jesus says to his disciples after announcing that he's about to leave, he says, where I go, you can't come with me right now. But then he says this, let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. Jesus has a permanent city, not one passing. And he's got a city that he's prepared for you and a place for you. Sometimes Kathy and I will drive around and we'll see these incredible homes, built out in the hills overlooking Lake Travis. And we'll say, man, it would be nice to live in a home like that. And then we go, well, hey, maybe one day we will. Sometimes you look at stuff that you think you have to have and you go, well, you know what? Who knows what we may have in the kingdom? God has a permanent city. It deserves your attention, your imagination. It's a city that he's prepared for you. And then finally, I want you to see it's a city preferred city. And this jumps out at us as we look at Moses. So let me finish reading, starting with verse 22, 3. Whatever that is. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be, that's key word there, choosing, preferring, electing. Okay, he's making a choice. I got 2 options. He says, not afraid of the king's edict, but by faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was what? Looking to the reward. Faith looks beyond to the eternal world. He was looking to the reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king. For he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Faith looks beyond the material. Faith is not limited to material, to the visible, but to the invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover, sprinkled the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. Faith looks forward to the eternal world. It's what I would call the preferred city. It's a choice that you make. Because as Jesus said to us often, you basically make a choice to really sell out for this world and hopefully get all that this world has to offer, whatever it is, whatever toys and trinkets that there is to be had in this world. And if it were possible to get them all, that compared to what he holds out in this future city, his kingdom and the eternal city. That there is something to be there, and you basically say, you know what? I'm either going to sell my soul for this or for this. And it's a choice that you make. You make it every day when you get up. you make it every time you make a choice about like where you work and why you work and, promotions and what you do with your money and your time and all these kinds of things reflect like which world are you living for? It's really a radical idea. This is what living with eternal perspective is. It's saying that every day I live with one of these two worlds in mind. I'm living for whatever glory there is in this little world, which is temporary, or living for whatever glory there is in the world to come. And I would love to be able to flesh that out and give you a slideshow of everything, but we're not given a lot. But what we're given is that you ought to imagine which world. Jesus says, why in the world would you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? For what good is it to gain the whole world but lose your own soul? And in that passage, I don't think he's talking about like becoming a Christian. I think he's talking about you, believer, that now belonging to Jesus Christ, how are you going to live and what are you going to live for? What are you going to invest in? In that the real satisfaction to our soul comes when we live an eternally significant life. So I think that's what's at play here. Before we go on, I want to draw your attention back to a phrase that I highlighted earlier. It says that these all died in faith, not having received the things promised. Now, here is the thing, that many times we believe that being serious followers of Christ will result in like this incredible sense of satisfaction and the deepest sense of abiding happiness. And part of what we learn in the book of Hebrews is that though there are satisfying times in our lives, that ultimately the deepest satisfaction that we long for will be had in heaven. That even for us, there is something that God has promised to us that won't be completely and consistently experienced until we go to be with Him. That this is true of us as well, that there's part of the promise that remains. That's why a person who lives with eternal perspective understands that he must not live kind of demanding complete satisfaction right now. That comes in the world to come. In fact, I think this is what Larry Crabb was trying to say, and let me show you this quote. Crabb speaks, and he says, the real battle in the human soul that knows Jesus is not to find a way to feel now what we long to feel in our inmost being, whether it's love, meaning, or the satisfaction of living an other-centered life. The real battle is to continue on in faithfulness, even when faithfulness brings no immediate experience of joy, even when it brings no prospect of felt joy until heaven. That's what it means to live by faith. That's the message of Hebrews chapter 11. Let me tell you, don't misread or mishear what I'm saying. That the abundant life, Jesus says, I've come to give you life and life abundantly. The abundant life is to be had now for those who follow radically Jesus Christ in obedience. But that joy is inconsistent and it's not complete and it's hard to maintain it. But we will have it fully in the world to come. And what he's saying is that now, remaining faithful now, staying in a marriage that is disappointing, instead of thinking, well, man, this is my only chance for happiness, I'm getting out of this thing. No, it's not. There's another world to come. Well, you know what? I could have a better life if I took all of my money and spent it on my own pleasure. Yeah, you could, but this isn't the only world. And Jesus says, if you give, you'll be rich in heaven. Lay up your treasure in heaven. That's the way people think who have embraced eternal perspective. That I'm living for something that I still can't experience fully now, but I will in the future. And so we all make that choice. Do I live for now or live for later? Well, the passage goes on. Third point point really I think that we could develop out of this passage is that faith looks down on this temporal world. It looks down on this temporal world. In other words, when we say, hey, there's this choice, I can live in this world or the following world, people with real faith, they go, live for this world? Why would I do that? They have that sense of looking down on the temporal world. So, faith looks beyond this material world. It looks forward to the eternal world, but it looks down on this temporal world. Now, as we come back to the text, just watch how he just goes in rapid fire, just listing person after person after person who made a mark on this world about living in faith. And I want you to see that they looked down on this temporal world. Now, to help orient you a little bit, two things happen. First of all, he's going to name a lot of people who experienced deliverance in this temporal world. Like, they received their kids back from the dead and things. Like in this temporal world, they received some promise. They received deliverance in this world. But then all of a sudden it turns, and then every example are those like who died, who received deliverance from this temporal world. That's kind of the distinction between here. They received deliverance from this temporal world. Let me just read through this. In verse 32, did I read 29? Yeah, I'll read 29. By faith, the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient because she had given him a friendly welcome to the spies. You may have noticed that all these examples he's giving follows biblical chronology. And so he's kind of moved through Moses and now Joshua and the conquest and now the judges. And watch this rapid fire in verse 32. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms. Look at this. They conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. And here's the turning point, where he talks about, and some received deliverance from this temporal world. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might, rise again to a better life. What are they doing? They're looking forward. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats and destitute, afflicted, mistreated. Watch this. Of whom the world was not worthy. I love that phrase. They said, okay, so you mean live for this world and I get to live, you're not going to kill me? Or you're going to kill me and I get to go there? No choice. I'm looking down. I look down on this temporal world. Of whom the world was not worthy. Wandering about in deserts, in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. And all these, though commended, there's the fifth repetition of that word. All of these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect. In other words, God was allowing time for us to come in to the plan. All right, so there's so much I want to say with so little time left. Let me just say this, that at this point, looking down on this temporal world, it kind of has the idea that, man, I am not selling out here. Now, one of the books that I read recently on my study leave was a book called The Insanity of God by Nick Ripken. Man, I tell you, every one of us ought to read this book. It's incredible. He writes, and after a real personal story, he moves where he travels the world, and he's interviewing people who are in the persecuted church around the world. And he interviews a lot of Russians who lived through, past the fall of communism, but lived under the oppression of the communist state and all the suffering that took place there. He also interviews believers in China, believers in the Muslim world, and he just tells story after story. But at one point, he's talking to people who are remembering back to their parents and grandparents in the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, where the persecution was so severe. And there were imprisonments and there were beatings and there were executions as well. And many were martyred for the faith. And I just have to read you. At one point, Nick Ripken is asking these guys, how in the world did you survive this? Like, how in the world did your parents prepare you for this? In fact, he writes, how did you or your family or your church or your people learn to live like this? How did you learn to die like that? Having heard of another example of someone executed for their faith. And this person he interviewed says this, I remember the day like it was yesterday, Nick. My father put his arms around me and my sister and my brother and guided us into the kitchen to sit around the table where he could talk with us. My mama was crying, so I knew that something was wrong. Papa didn't look at her because he was talking directly to us, and he said, children, you know that I'm the pastor of our church. That's what God has called me to do, so tell others about him. I have learned that the communist authorities will come tomorrow to arrest me. They will put me in prison because they want me to stop preaching about Jesus. But I cannot stop doing that because I must obey God. I will miss you very much, but I will trust God to watch over you while I'm gone. And he hugged each one of us. And then he said, all around this part of the country, the authorities are rounding up followers of Jesus and demanding that they deny their faith. Sometimes when they refuse, the authorities will line up whole families and hang them by the neck until they are dead. And I don't want this to happen to our family, so I'm praying that once they put me in prison, they will leave you and your mother alone. However, and here he paused and made eye contact with us, if I am in prison and I hear that my wife and my children have been hung to death rather than deny Jesus, I will be the most proud man in that prison. Now you're starting to feel a little bit like the readers of the book of Hebrews, because that's what they were facing. And he says, losing whatever this world holds out to you, it's not worth it. Remain faithful to Jesus. Lean into him. Serve him. Tell others about him. Because the world to come is so far superior. That's the idea. I want to ask our worship team to come up, and as they do, I just tell you, one of the stories that had such impact on me was, he said, someone was speaking once, he said, listen, I want you to imagine a tribe of people in some unknown place, had a very unique custom that every 20 years they elected a new chief of the tribe, of this island community. And it was really unusual because if you got elected or you got chosen, that for 20 years you had absolute authority over everybody, could enjoy whatever pleasure the island culture had to offer. And it was life, the very best of what the island had to offer. And it was yours for 20 years. And here's the only catch, is after 20 years, you would be exiled to an island that was, completely deserted, and you spend the remainder of your days there. But yet, nevertheless, there was no shortage of people who signed up and say, "Man, I'd like 20 years of just the world of the very best." And then one particular person on occasion came into that position, and for 20 years, instead of just indulging in whatever pleasure the island offered, he used his authority to begin caring for the people and investing in them. And he did so in a way that people appreciated what he was doing. And meanwhile, he also did one other thing. He began to start shipping different resources off to the island that he was going to be exiled to. And by doing so, after his 20 years when he was exiled, many people on the island went with him out of just appreciation for his investment in them. And when he got there, he had both not only relationships, but much resource available. An eternal perspective looks like that. It looks like I'm living for the world to come. I'm going to bring as many people with me as I possibly can. And I'm going to invest all the time and all the money that I can in the world to come. That's what we need to do.